Hello. In this video, I want to talk about COVID-19 data transparency, or more importantly, lack of data transparency for COVID-19. Before I really delve into it, I'm going to tell you a quick story. One day, probably about 3 weeks ago, I woke up and the first thing I did was look at this dashboard. It looked a little bit different back then, but essentially the same thing, and get really angry. And the reason I got really angry, and when I say dashboard, I'm doing some double quotes and air quotes around it. The reason I got really angry is because of how useless this information on this dashboard is. And the problem with this dashboard is because it only shows me what countries have been affected, and day by day bubbles would get a little bit bigger, but it really doesn't tell me things are getting better, things are getting worse. It really, other than the total confirmed counts and the counts, I really couldn't understand what was going on in the world. I mean, I understood that it's an important, COVID-19 was not a good thing. I was really nervous about things spreading, but I really had no information to know, should I be worried, how bad things are, anything like this. So I did what anyone would do. I decided I'll build my own dashboard. And I figured out where to get the data, got the data, and I pulled that stuff in, and I was able to build trends and deaths and rates, and then I added colors so you can know whether things are getting bad, if the indicator is in red, yellow if things are okay, or green if things are getting better. So I've added a lot of logic to my dashboard, and I did it for myself because I really wanted to know what is going on, and I just was not getting anywhere with any information available publicly. And today, when the new data came out, I looked at the trends, and having listened to the press conference from the Corona Task Force earlier that painted a pretty rosy pictures that things are getting better, and I looked at the data from today and I got really upset. And I will explain why I got upset in a few minutes. But first, let's take a look at why some of these numbers really need to be scrutinized. Specifically, let's start with new cases. What are we measuring? I'm not a doctor, but even a quick research will make it apparent that today, at the World Health Organization's directive, doctors are ticking two boxes as they examine the patients. Box number 1 answers the question whether the patient tests positive for SARS-CoV-2 virus, and that test is done using some sort of testing equipment. The other box basically is for the doctor that does not have access to such equipment. So the doctor can tick off that box if the patient looks like he or she, it just looks like he or she has the SARS-CoV-2 infection. The real question, however, is what should we be measuring for the new cases? So I pulled a quick definition from Wikipedia on what coronavirus disease is. And you can see that it's defined as a severe acute respiratory syndrome. And that syndrome has certain symptoms. And these symptoms include fever, cough, shortness of breath. Let's go back to the prior slide. Do these two questions the doctors get to tick on their forms for coronavirus infection appear like they serve well in identifying the severity and the symptoms for the COVID-19 disease? I think the answer is pretty obvious. The way to solve that problem is to add a few other pieces of information to that form. Number 1 is we need to know the date of first symptoms. And we also need to know the date of reporting. So if I come back to see a doctor and I have high fever and I'm coughing, but I have been sick for 5 days, then the date of symptoms would be that date of 5 days ago. And that's important because I could have been infecting a bunch of people in those 5 days. What is being reported today is only date of reporting. So clearly that information is very inaccurate. With respect to understanding the trends, we're always at least 5 to 7 days in arrears as we're looking at these numbers. So by us looking at new cases, we're not getting a clear picture of what really is going on because we're looking at things that already occurred 5-7 days ago because we're looking at the days of reporting. Also, it would be nice to get the symptoms. Imagine if I had a form and the form had a simple set of checkboxes like fever, cough, shortness of breath, or none. And then if I did get a chance to test, I'd have a checkbox for yes or no, whether the patient was tested. And if the patient was tested, I would then say positive or negative. And then the other interesting thing for the data set would be what comorbidities does the patient have. Again, I'm not a doctor. I just whipped up the first 4 that I found online: high blood pressure, diabetes, cancer, or other. If we were able to have these data at our fingertips, I think we'd be able to come up with much more meaningful and comprehensive analysis. Let's take a look at an example for the date of reporting versus date of symptoms. Let's take a look at these 2 spikes. So we're looking at France, and we see these 2 spikes about a week apart. So clearly, it's very unlikely that on these 2 days, all of a sudden, number of sick people went from 2,000 a day to 20,000 a day, right? So most likely, the government has been collecting this data, sent it to the lab. Lab did 20,000, maybe 100,000 tests, came back and said 20,000 were positive. They all got reported on the same day. That's completely misleading. And if you look at the trend analysis for France, you see negative, positive spikes. That's just unacceptable. The next thing I want to talk about was deaths. Deaths is probably the most important statistics of all because ultimately it's deaths, and specifically the mortality rate, or how deadly the disease is what helps us shape our policies, right? I mean, you don't have to have a PhD in any science to know that if only 1 person in 1 billion dies, then the disease is not as dangerous if 100 people out of 200 die, right? So currently we have a mortality rate defined as number of deaths divided by number of total cases, and usually it's presented as a percentage. I have another video that I did a few days ago, about a week ago, that shows that when the new cases are growing rapidly, this measure is completely irrelevant and not helpful. So when we see those press conferences and they talk about this mortality rate, it's very disingenuous when this mortality rate is being quoted, because when we are in a in the phase of rapid growth of new cases, that number is completely skewed. So in our dashboards, I created an effective mortality rate, and what I do there is I look at the deaths in the last 5 days, and I make an assumption that people who die in the last 5 days probably got reported in days 10 from 10 to 5 days ago. So if I divide deaths from 5 days to number of cases, new cases reporting from days 10 to day 5, that gives me a more effective kind of temporal snapshot of the mortality rate right now. So I argue that as we do the analysis of our data with respect to mortality rate, it's the effective mortality rate that we should be paying attention to, and this is the piece of data that's particularly important to report to people as we try to understand the danger of the disease and the progress of the disease and how it's affecting our health system. So now that we understand that deaths is very important because it's the death rate, mortality that is driving the mitigation response. Do we get to go to work? Do we get to go see a movie? Or do we have to stay at home for 7 or 8 or 10 or 15 weeks? Right? So you would expect, so when it comes to deaths, we're going to have a lot more information because we need to show the public that the decisions that are being made make sense. So what do we know about deaths? Well, it's not any different from new cases. As it comes to deaths, we know whether the patient tested positive, or do we think that the patient died from SARS-CoV-2? There's a lot of videos on the internet that go much deeper in the subject, but as we take a look at the data later on, we will see that this particular piece of information is very inconsistent across multiple countries and makes it very difficult to understand why certain decisions are being made and understand the severity of the situation. So as we look at deaths and effective mortality rate, let's start with a country that we'll use as a benchmark to try to understand if the data that we're looking at, number one, does it make sense? Is it good enough to make any sort of policy decisions? So let's click on Sweden. And the way these things work, if you haven't seen my videos before, in this chart, we're trending new cases. They're bars. And we see that bars are getting taller, which means we're getting more and more new cases every day. We also see these dips, and they usually occur in the weekend when countries are not reporting quite as diligently than weekdays. So you will see that similar trend across multiple markets, multiple countries. And the white line here indicates the mortality rate, effective mortality rate. So you can see that effective mortality rate changes as the cases go, we have more and more cases or fewer cases. So in case of Sweden, we see that when cases were low, mortality was low, right? So mortality was around 2%. As cases started to pile up, mortality goes up. Cases go up, mortality goes up. Cases go down, mortality goes down. This makes sense. And overall, as disease continues, you would expect that the system of treating patients becomes more efficient. We get more and better drugs and methods of how to treat the disease. So over time, if let's say we do not get herd immunity, we would expect these numbers to go down, even when the cases stay relatively high. Now let's look at some other countries. The next country I want to take a look is Ireland. Ireland looks very similar. We see a spike of mortality that happens when the data set is very small. So for example, a nursing home gets affected, a lot of people die, and then you could see this high mortality even though maybe there was only 10 or 20 people died. But as cases start to build up, we see the same kind of relationship, right? We see cases go up, mortality rate goes up. And then as time goes by, even with higher cases, mortality goes down because we learn more on how to treat the disease and hopefully we could save more people. Now let's take a look at Italy. Italy completely does not make any sense. Italy today has a mortality rate of almost 12%, 11.5%. If we go back to, let's say, May 5 or March 5, March 5th, more than a month ago, mortality was still 12.23%. How does that make any sense? Italy has had high mortality with almost no cases, very super high cases, and then cases are going down, mortality stays exactly the same. What are those guys counting? Now let's take a look at China. Look at Chinese distribution. We go from having 11,000 cases a day, 15,000 cases a day, 6,000 cases a day, to almost nothing in just about a week. And we have the mortality rate going completely crazy. Our cases are so low, yes, yet the mortality rate is so high. So the mortality rate is on this side. Effective mortality rate goes up to 20%, 16%, with almost having no cases. Yet when we have a lot of cases, the mortality rate is 1.75%. That just doesn't make any sense. So if we are to use Italy or Canada as assumptions for our US models, how does it make any sense? Clearly neither Italy nor China behave in a manner that makes any sense. So we have either accounting issues, data quality issues, who knows what kind of issues, but it's disingenuous to take their data and use that data as a proxy to what might happen in the United States or any other country. It just doesn't make any sense. However, I have even a bigger question, $2.3 trillion question. Apparently, at least in the US and I think worldwide, the process of collecting data has already been in place for AIDS and influenza. So why are we not collecting the data for COVID-19 in the same way? And more importantly, if data is collected at the grain that makes sense for meaningful analysis, why is it that this data is not available for general public? Earlier I said that I looked at the data for today and got really upset. So why was I so upset? Well, number one is I was not happy to see a lot more red bubbles for different states today versus tomorrow. So obviously cannot wait for all the states to turn green and for this disease to go away already. But the thing that got me really upset is this spike in deaths. If you take a look at this, according to the data that's available to us, we had almost 4,600 deaths yesterday, which is up from 2,500, and then a few days ago was 1,500. Anybody who has been looking at these trends will see that this trends in deaths is not commensurate to the distribution of new cases. We didn't have a huge spike. So for the last many days, cases were fairly steady, right? How is it all of a sudden that we have these huge spikes in deaths that are happening over the last day or two? And the most obvious answer is that it's not that more people died yesterday. It's just we're changing the accounting principle. We're looking at people who are already dead, and we're just deciding to label them as COVID-19 deaths. This kind of spike just does not make any sense unless we're just playing with our data definitions. So as I was looking at the data, it was clear that there was some sort of change in accounting principle that occurred around April 5th in several countries and also in US. Let's take a look at the actual data and you guys will see what I mean. Let's start with Switzerland. We could see that Switzerland had a very low mortality rate when cases were fairly high. Then the cases started to drop, but the mortality rate started to go up. Does it make any sense? Not really. Let's look at Austria now. Cases went up, started to come down, yet around April 5th, cases are coming down, but the rate keeps going up. And then we have dramatic decrease in cases, yet the mortality keeps going up. Again, doesn't make any sense. The way they account for classification of their data must have changed. Now let's take a look at Germany. That's probably the most apparent example yet, right? Cases up, mortality low. Around April 5th, something's changed. All of a sudden the mortality rate started going up and one of the cases are going drastically down. Clearly we're not counting the same thing in the last 2 weeks that we counted before. These numbers are completely meaningless. Now let's see if we have the same issue in US. Rockland County, New York. Cases up, mortality low. Cases down, mortality high. Again, effective mortality is the white line, right? So we see around April 5th, when cases started to come down, I would expect these numbers. Mortality can lag. It's a lagging indicator, so it's okay if it lags for a couple of days. But it's still very high. Cases are going down, mortality is up. Westchester, New York. I mean, the data speaks for itself. Nassau County, same thing. Something happened around April 5th with respect to the way we count and classify deaths, and that completely skews all of our analysis. This data is completely unreliable. Making any sort of policy decisions based on this data set is probably, I would say, is not recommended. Now, in conclusion, a few things to note. We're trying to solve the problem of COVID-19 disease using medieval methods. The concept of social isolation is at least 600 years old. I found this very curious that we're trying to address COVID-19 the same way we were trying to, and when I say we, humanity was trying to deal with bubonic plague. I'm not saying that we're treating the patients the same way. Obviously, the medicine today is amazing. However, it's really troubling that the way we deal with the root cause of solving the problem has not changed in 600 years. Something does not make any sense. The measurements in new cases and deaths are just not helpful. There's no consistency in measurements across countries and through time. So we cannot say this is what happened in Italy or Spain or France or UK, any other country, and use that for drawing any sort of conclusions about what's going to happen in US. Everybody is accounting for things in a completely different fashion. And then you can also see that it's not consistent through time, right? So you could see what's happened in China, absolutely makes no sense. And then as you look at other countries, again, the accounting principles are changed, and the data set is no longer useful for relevant analysis. And the most important one is the most essential details related to this disease are not available to public. So what should happen? What should happen for us to be in a better place? Well, data transparency is a must. We have a lot of garbage data, and if we have good data, that data needs to be made available to public immediately, given the drastic measures that the societies have had to deal with to deal with the problem. And we also need to start developing data collection tools so that we can track new cases more efficiently, whether it's an app, website, something that would make it easier for either doctors or even patients to report their cases. Now, I'm particularly sensitive to the privacy issue of privacy of that data. So these tools have to be supervised and overseen by independent third parties to make sure that there's no abuse of that data by any party. That anonymized data set must be made available to public, and all assumptions and drivers for any models used for policymaking must be made available to public as well. If you've ever gone to a manager and requested $1,000 for a project, you probably had to build a very serious case with PowerPoints and charts to prove to the powers that be that your ask makes sense. It's amazing that all these drastic mitigation measures that were put in place without any quality data to back any of them up, and we cannot have the situation repeat again. So we're looking at another waves of COVID-19 later this year, and hopefully, and possibly next year. Any sort of mitigation measures that would occur at that time would have to be accompanied by all of these tools and all of this data that must be available to public. I was trying to keep this video fairly short. Unfortunately, it ran a little bit longer than I was hoping. Hope you liked the video, and please come back again in a few days for the next one. Thanks. Bye.